Okay. Well, I kind of regret that I actually finished this a while ago because with all of these talks on such closely related topics, I wish I could adapt mine a bit. Anyway, as an overview, consilience refers to independent support of the same fact or explanation by multiple independent lines of evidence. Now, the modern scientific consensus is supported by consilient evidence from many different fields. Now, as we in the SSE all very well know, there are also a lot of anomalies observed. They're incompatible with that. And the essence of my argument here is that enough anomalies have been observed to provide consilient support for an alternative framework that would, I think, be on a better footing to challenge the current consensus rather than trying to chip away around the edges anomaly by anomaly. Just a quick look at the sections of this talk. So starting with consilience and consensus, and I'm going to skip over I'm going to try to go fast here because I think people are now aware of a lot of applications of consilience. It's been used since ancient times, not under that name. A lot of our, well, all of our mainstream scientific theories that everybody has heard of enjoy considerable consilient support. And synthesizing that over the course of time has brought us to the mainstream worldview of reductionistic materialism, which has also been discussed a lot. But the structure of that is that basic models are supported by consilient observations of many different types, and then these models themselves provide consilient support for underlying models. And ultimately, that's all drawn together into the premise that physical reality consists of elementary particles and fields interacting according to mathematically specifiable laws, and that's it. That is the whole of reality. Now, you can still get emergent properties. One of the simplest examples of an emergent property is temperature, which is meaningless for a single particle. It's a property only of bulk collections. And again, at each transition between levels of explanation, there are huge numbers of consilient observations to support the connection. So, now that we've outlined what we're up against, I'm going to try to make a brief catalog of anomalies, but when thinking about anomalies, I can't resist this quote from Jorge Luis Borges. "We, the undivided divinity operating within us, have dreamt the world. We have dreamt it as firm, mysterious, visible, ubiquitous in space, and durable in time. But in its architecture, we have allowed tenuous and eternal crevices of unreason which tell us it is false." So a scientific anomaly is something that doesn't fit with the current scientific understanding. Trouble is, a natural law cannot have exceptions. So any natural law that seems to have exceptions isn't really a law. And because it can be an awful lot of work to try to eliminate and replace a currently accepted law, it's awfully tempting to ignore anomalous observations and dismiss them as an error of some kind. So the SSE, of course, we're all about anomalies. We've been presenting them for years. So I'm going to try to make a brief survey of anomalous topics that the SSE has looked at and how they relate to the mainstream consensus. I do not claim that this is comprehensive. It's only a 25-minute talk, 20 minutes aside from questions. Now, some SSE topics fit quite easily into the mainstream consensus. Cryptozoology. There is no fundamental law that says that there can't be any undiscovered animals. Cryptozoology is only a fringe topic because it's caught in a catch-22. Anytime the cryptozoologists verify that something exists, it stops being part of their subject matter. Electrosensitivity, a very contentious topic, but we had a very good session on that 2 years ago in Yale, and basically the only reason that electrosensitivity is a fringe topic is that the American Physical Society doesn't want to believe in it. Now, anomalies that may fit the mainstream consensus. Dowsing. Most people think of dowsing as a psychic phenomenon, but in 95, Hans-Dieter Betz published a tremendous monograph in the JSE in which he argued that dowsing is actually a learnable, trainable physical sensitivity to geophysical effects. UFOs. Last year, Hal Puthoff gave us an excellent talk on evidence that some UFO sightings appear very strongly now to be piloted vehicles that surpass any known human technology. Again, there is nothing in the laws of nature that says that our technology is the best possible. And there is nothing in the laws of nature that says that all intelligence has to be human. So UFOs of this class might fit perfectly well into the existing consensus because we don't know what the limits of possible technology are. Non-ETI UFOs, people are looking into Earth lights, anomalous weather phenomena. Again, they may fit just fine into the mainstream. We don't know if they require any revisions of our current understanding of natural law. And then there is healing, which I apologize to all of the people who love healing research. It's tremendously important. It's also tremendously broad and diverse. It covers a vast number of different topics. And now it might be, I'll be revisiting it later as things that don't fit, but there are some people, for example, Oshman, who argues that healing is essentially manipulating the bioelectromagnetic field of the human organism in beneficial ways that look like they would fit into the mainstream consensus with very little fiddling. And then there are the things that just don't fit the consensus at all. And I've tried to group these into three broad topics: survival, information acquisition, and mental influence on physical systems. At this point, I want to make a brief comment about fraud. Almost everything that I'm about to discuss has been subject to allegations of fraud and, in a few cases, proof of fraud. So as not to repeat the same point every time, I'm simply going to note here that for every phenomenon I'm discussing, there is strong evidence that some cases are not fraudulent. Okay, survival. And this is multiple types of observation that suggest that human consciousness can persist after death. There is physical mediumship, where some physical mediums have produced physical phenomena which they attribute to spirits of the deceased. For more information, talk to Steve Browdy. Mental mediumship, there is also a large body of very convincing evidence that mental mediums acquire veridical information from deceased personalities. For more information, talk to Julie Beischel. Research done on channeling suggests that as new agey and suspicious as it is, it seems to be much the same thing as mental mediumship. Yeah, I can't tell you to ask Arthur Hastings about it because he's dead. Then well, yes, you'll have to consult a medium or be one. Then past lives. The work of Stevenson, Haraldson, Tucker, and for all I know others, has generated a lot of evidence that some children spontaneously develop first-person memories from other people who lived before them. And this seems to me to be a very convincing line of evidence that human personalities exist before birth as well as after death, and that they move from body to body. There are out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences. I'm sorry to lump those together. I'm sure that purists would have lots of objections, but the point I find of interest here is that they provide strong evidence that people continue to experience consciousness even while their brains are flatlining and doing no detectable neural processing. And then there's discarnates, a topic that I've heard several survival researchers discuss, which seems to basically they're trying to detect the presence of bodiless intelligences in their laboratories, and they have met with some measure of success in doing so. Okay, information acquisition. remote viewing, and I'm sorry that the format is so messed up there. But I'm using that as a catch-all term for something that actually incorporates several different consilient lines of experimental evidence already, including not just what's explicitly called remote viewing, which has multiple training technologies, multiple evaluation methodologies, but also I'd like to use this category to collect remote perception studies, Ganzfeld studies, and older Rhinian paradigm experiments of looking at clairvoyance, precognition, and telepathy. Then another genre is presentiment experiments, which now have a very large body of evidence that human beings will have measurable physiological reactions to unpredictable stimuli before they happen. Okay, physical consequences of RV, PCRV for short. I admit this is just one experiment, but I think it's a very important experiment. Dean Radin has published results showing that putting a remote viewer's viewpoint of observation into a quantum mechanical experiment to observe the process has the same effect on the quantum statistics as sticking in any other low-resolution measuring tool. Then D-mills is another genre of experiment, direct mental influence on living systems, since that always involves both a target and an agent. There is some question on D-mills experiments whether it should be regarded as the target acquiring information or the agent imposing an influence, so I'm going to list it in both places. Now, mental influence, micro-PK, and of course, I simply couldn't resist putting at least one pair slide in this talk. But detectable change in the behavior of random physical systems resulting from some sort of mental intervention, and there is, again, a huge body of evidence on the topic. Macro-PK. Most reports of macro-PK are anecdotal, but at last year's meeting, we had one person presenting, Sean McNamara, who's shown at the right of the slide, presenting on a technique for training telekinesis, as he calls it, and another presenter at that conference presented successful replication with McNamara's technique. So that looks to me like a pretty good case of replication. Continuing mental influence, okay, repeat appearance of D-mills, repeat appearance of PCRV, and then just in order to have a different name for it, I'm using bio-PK to refer to anomalous healing that doesn't fit in to the electromagnetic paradigm. Things like effects at a long distance, effects that take place off time. And now, finding anomalous consilience, trying to integrate these various findings from different kinds of studies. It seems to me to fall out very naturally into three hypotheses, each of which have multiple lines of support. So, first hypothesis, humans or human-like minds can function without physical brains or bodies. So, mediumship, NDE, past lives, and discarnates all seem to support this hypothesis, and they are using very different methodologies. Humans can gain information about the world by means other than the known physical senses. Again, that's demonstrated by RV, presentiment, D-mills, and PCRV. And a third hypothesis, humans can affect the world by means other than manipulation with their physical bodies. Lines of support there are micro-PK, macro-PK, PCRV, D-mills, and bio-PK. Now, those three hypotheses, given that each of them enjoys a considerable level of consilient support from multiple experiments, can be taken as consilient support for an overarching hypothesis. Important parts of the human mind, including its internal operations as well as inputs from and outputs to the surrounding world, are not physical. Okay, and by not physical, I'm using a shorthand, not composed of any known form of matter or energy. We could take this to mean some currently unknown form of matter and energy, except that current mainstream consensus physics insists that there is no room in the theory for any such new entities. So thank you, my fellow physicist colleagues. Your intransigence has forced me to deny the validity of your entire field. Good going. Now, the concept of non-physical entities is often rejected on the basis of another premise: only physical things can interact with physical things. I'm not citing that because I don't know how many times I've heard it. It's an error in reasoning. You can take that premise as a definition of what you mean by physical. The trouble is, when you take that as the definition of physical, you give up the idea to assume a lot of conventional things about what we consider physical, such that they take up space or have a definite location. So, trying to sketch a new consensus, and all this is going to be is a sketch. Consciousness is not dependent on a material brain and therefore cannot be an emergent property of material structures. And it interacts with the rest of the world by rules that differ from currently known physical law. It seems natural to conclude from that that consciousness is a fundamental part of reality with its own rules and properties. Now, this has been stipulated by philosophers going back hundreds of years, but here we can see that it's also an inference emerging from consilient evidence. Now, what do I mean by fundamental? There are at least three different versions that have been propounded by philosophers. Idealism, consciousness is the only thing that's real. Dualism, consciousness and materials are equally real. And panpsychism, consciousness is fundamental because it is part of every physical system down to elementary particles. And I would contend that we can afford to be agnostic and not choose between or among these alternatives. We can just go with fundamental and worry about the details later. Now, an unexpected bonus: astrology is another perennial topic in the SSE. And it actually fits very nicely into this sketch consensus, the link being a proposal by the late astrologer Zipporah Dobyns, no relation, suggested that the mechanism for astrology is that human personalities preparing to incarnate choose to be born at symbolically appropriate times. So, finally, I recommend for future directions. I'll leave the slide up during Q&A, but I'd say that our most urgent need is ways to measure and quantify aspects of consciousness, because the rest of our understanding of science is fundamentally mathematical. We're never going to be able to integrate it until we get a mathematical understanding of consciousness. Thank you.
Thank you, Jörg. I just want to mention this is really great, especially for some of our new members, because you've covered really all the topics and a great overview. I also want to mention to everybody that Jörg Dobyns holds the record for the number of questions at the microphone. What is your question? All right, Carl, take it away.
So, Jörg, I'd like to run one idea by you. You were talking about the laws governing consciousness might not match up with any known physical laws. And I have kind of something I picked up in a book called Thought Forms. And in Thought Forms, there was a drawing by something called a harmonograph, which was a pendulum-like drawing device, apparently popular in the 19th century. And they used that to draw, quote, thought forms, so the psychics who wrote the book could directly perceive thoughts. And it was interesting to me that the drawing machine, the harmonograph, was drawing images that were similar to their own perceptions. And so that would involve, for example, a relationship of an XY swinging. So it would seem then that the laws governing that both the psychically perceived and material things from our more mainstream world seem to follow, or would suggest they follow, similar principles, for example, of proportionality.
On the one hand, that's a very interesting example that I don't know enough about, and certainly things like the harmonic oscillator behavior are sufficiently abstract and mathematical, it's not surprising to see them showing up in different areas. But that's basically all I have to say about it. We don't know enough.
Basically, I'd like to make a comment as we're closing out this session on consilience, and with some reference to your talk here, if I may. I too had to look up what is consilience. And being a bit of a wordsmith, I found con, meaning with, and then I put that together with silience, and I thought, well, maybe a little bit of humor in the whole thing doesn't really hurt. In fact, I think we need a lot of that when we're taking a look at, excuse me, anomalies, because that is where the discovery lies, I think, and you're certainly right about that. But in looking further, I thought, conciliatory is a very close word, and I think when we're doing all of this, it's not necessarily been mentioned as a word, but we have to take a look at relaxing our assumptions so both sides can come together with a little more humility and relaxing our values and assumptions if we're really going to make some progress. So thank you for letting me say that.
All right, one quick comment by Glenn Ryan, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Okay, so I hate to disagree with you, but I really have
All
to.
right.
I really have to say this. When you say that there's no room in mathematical physics for new energies, there are numerous solutions to Maxwell's equations that do not generate a classical electromagnetic field, and there are many such equations in physics that generate solutions to fields which are described, but they're not accepted because they're virtual or they're time reversed or they don't, they're not typical for sure. But there are many, many examples in mathematical physics of new energies.
This is, to some extent, getting down into too much detail to discuss in a brief presentation, but my statement about no room for new fields is based on the public announcements of various prominent physicists that we've got the standard model. There can't be any additional fields that it isn't taking into account.
I think you guys have a lunch date to clear this all out. All right, let's thank our speaker and enjoy your lunch.
If Kenneth